Today's video was made possible by Masterworks. More on this in a moment. By now, I think everyone, absolutely everyone, is familiar with news stories like this, because we talked about it very recently on VisualPolitik.
EU asks countries to cut gas demand by 15% until spring.
Russia's cruel and unjustified invasion of Ukraine and the ensuing international sanctions have put the countries of the European Union right in Vladimir Putin's crosshairs. And that is something that is somewhat frightening in a way. Don't forget that in countries like the Czech Republic, Austria, Germany, and Slovakia, it is not uncommon for the temperature to reach minus 15 degrees Celsius. So spending a winter without heating is almost an impossible challenge to meet. The problem, as you can see on this map, is that many European countries have become terribly dependent on Russian gas. And of all of them, there is one case that is particularly striking because of its enormous consumption and the importance of its economy for the entire European Union. First clue is that it is by far the largest contributor to the community club. It can only be Germany. During the first half of 2022, and despite the Ukrainian war, German dependence on Russian gas stood at around 40%. This makes a possible gas cutoff by Moscow to be perceived as a nightmare, both economically and socially. A gas cutoff could mean that many factories would have to close down, and heating systems would stop working, as winter drives temperatures to several degrees below zero. To make matters worse, German gas reserves are very tight, and at the time of making this video, it is estimated that they could, at best, meet demand for about 2.5 months. This is clearly not enough to last through the European winter.
Germany's top energy regulator says the country can last just 2.5 months without Russian gas, and there will be a difficult autumn and winter ahead.
In fact, after Nord Stream 1 was cut for maintenance for 10 days, Germany was forced to draw on its winter reserves in the middle of the summer, which, as you can imagine, has not exactly helped the country to further prepare for the arrival of cold weather.
Russia's gas shutoff is forcing Europe's biggest buyer of its supplies to draw down winter emergency reserves. The company has had to lean on its emergency winter supplies to meet contractual obligations to its customers.
Now, all of this about Germany's enormous dependence on Russian gas is something we all know. So far, nothing new. The question is, how far did Germany's addiction to Russian gas really go? How on earth did this situation come about? Why did Germany expose itself so heavily to supplies from a country like Russia? Did no one see the gigantic political risk involved? Well, VisualPolitik viewers, the truth is that the matter has been going on for a long time, and that there is no single person responsible for it. Not even the former Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder himself, who ended up being appointed as an executive of Gazprom by Putin, receiving a millionaire's salary, and who, of course, has now become radioactive. Nobody wants to have ties with him. But wait a minute, because in this video, we are not only going to see who is to blame for Germany's enormous weakness, but we are also going to try to understand what exactly the situation in which Germany finds itself is, and what this may entail. So, how on earth did the Germans fail to take security of supply and political risk into account when designing their energy system? Who is responsible for this gigantic mess? And what may prove to be even more important for the future? What may happen if Russian gas supplies to Europe's largest power are eventually cut off? Well, let's take a look. But before that, let me tell you something that I think will interest you. The first half of 2022 has portfolios begging for mercy. Inflation runs rampant through savings, and markets are pushed to the brink of a recession. The S&P 500, the index tracking the 500 largest public companies in the United States, has suffered its biggest first half fall since 1970. And if we take record-breaking 9.1% inflation into account, then in real terms, it has been the biggest fall since 1872. What a 6 months. So naturally, taking all of this into account, the question is, how can we diversify to avoid these scares and protect our savings? Well, according to Deloitte, 85% of professional wealth managers recommend art as an asset to include in our portfolios because it has a near zero correlation to stocks and bonds. But up until now, you would have needed millions to get this safe haven asset into your portfolio. So that's where Masterworks saw an opportunity. They allow you to invest in shares of multi-million-dollar artworks, an uncorrelated asset that can help diversify your wealth and protect it from inflation. But it's not just about preserving the wealth you already have, because to date, Masterworks has sold 5 paintings with an average net return of 26.8% to investors. Of course, past performance is no guarantee of future results, but it's no wonder Masterworks is a startup unicorn with over 500,000 users. You can skip Masterworks' waitlist by using the link below. And as always, in everything related to investment, be cautious. There is no such thing as risk-free.
My My Russian Friend.
Okay, relations between the Germans and the Russians, especially with regard to the energy issue, are not exactly recent. On the 1st of February 1970, high-ranking politicians and gas industry officials from Germany and the then Soviet Union signed the contract for the construction of the first gas pipeline between the Siberian gas fields and consumers in the Federal Republic of Germany. Yes, that is correct. Not even the Iron Curtain, the impermeable and icy barrier that dominated the Cold War, prevented Russian gas from starting to flow from the Soviet extraction fields to the west. And it is not just that gas began to flow between antagonistic countries, but that not even the high tensions of the Cold War succeeded in endangering the supply. And so, little by little, over the decades, this sense of security made it possible, brick by brick, to develop strong ties of trust and commercial friendship between the Germans and the Russians. Ties that have been maintained until now, and that had their starting point with the so-called Ostpolitik, a process of normalization of relations between West Germany and the Eastern Bloc promoted by former German Chancellor Willy Brandt, pronounced Billy. However, if these ties have lasted over time, it is because for almost 50 years, these Russian-German relations have brought many benefits to both sides. For example, for decades, Germany took advantage of an abundant and very cheap supply of gas to fuel its advanced heavy industry, an industry that placed itself in a very competitive position, both at the European and global levels. This is precisely what explains why German consumption of Russian gas will continue to grow until 2021. In return, Russia not only received an immense amount of dollars, but Germany also treated Russia as a priority partner and sold it all kinds of industrial goods and advanced technology. It was, so to speak, a very clear win-win situation. Now, let's go back to the question we asked earlier. Why did West Germany make the decision to throw itself into the arms of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc to solve its energy needs? Well, at that time, German politicians were convinced, and history shows that they were not so wrong, that promoting trade with the Eastern Bloc was the best way to improve political stability in Europe. The more trade, the better. And let's see, we certainly won't be the ones trying to refute that idea. The problem is that energy trading is not like buying and selling cars, washing machines, or sneakers. Energy is the basis of the productive and economic system, and that is why securing the supply of energy, even though it may entail higher costs, is essential. However, the idea that something could stop the supply did not even cross the minds of German politicians until almost 4 days ago.
Long-term disruption of the energy supply would be against the self-interest of the Soviet Union. German Ministries report, late 1980s. Those engaging in trade with each other do not shoot at one another. Helmut Schmidt, former West Germany Chancellor, to Jimmy Carter. To speak of the Federal Republic's economic dependence on Moscow to a degree large enough to affect foreign policy indicates ignorance or malice. Helmut Schmidt in 1980.
And so, right up until 2021, Germany developed a savage dependence on Russia. By that year, no less than 55% of its entire gas consumption came from Russia. The perception was that the more cheap Russian gas coming into Germany, the better. So, for example, when German gas production began to decline due to depletion of some fields and pressure from environmental groups, do you know what the Germans did? 3, 2, 1. Exactly, they asked the Russians for more gas. Not even after the invasion and subsequent annexation of Crimea did German politicians take steps to diversify their energy sources, and in fact, the motivation came from even further away.
Germany to shut all nuclear reactors, move prompted by mass protests against nuclear power following Japan's nuclear disaster.
But of course, who cared? As long as German politicians could sell economic successes and cheap energy, why worry about Russia? Why waste time thinking about things like energy security? And even more so if they could do business. This was the mentality of former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. He was at the helm of Germany between 1998 and 2005, and not only boasts of being Putin's colleague and visiting him frequently, but he also worked on projects linked to the Russian government that he himself had promoted. This was the case, for example, with Nord Stream, a Russian-controlled company that was in charge of building the first undersea pipeline connecting Russia to Germany.
Venceremos.
Putin himself urged Schroeder to become chairman of the shareholders committee, and so, in exchange for a generous salary, Schroeder took it upon himself to promote the benefits of Russian gas throughout Germany. And that was not his only dedication. Since 2017, Schroeder also sat on the board of directors of the Russian oil company Rosneft. The reward for keeping his armchair warm? Another $600,000 a year.
He took advantage of the reputation and influence of the Chancellor's office and offered himself up as an agent for Russian interests to get rich. Norbert Röttgen, a conservative lawmaker and former minister.
Of course, it was not an isolated case. Many German politicians, directly or indirectly, participated in this huge business until the bubble burst. Their excuse was that Russia would never cut off the gas supply because it was not interested in taking such an economic loss. The problem is that today, we know that not everyone behaves as efficiently as the rigid German politicians. Once again, if Vladimir Putin has taught us anything, it is that sometimes the most rational option is not the option of choice. In other circumstances, the irrational invasion of Ukraine would never have taken place. So, with this in mind, the question is, how deep does Germany's problem go? Well, let's take a look.
The game that's lost before it's begun.
Despite all the efforts that have been made to reduce it, Germany's dependence on Russian gas is still around 40% of its total gas consumption. And if that is already a concern, things can get even worse.
The situation would be even worse if imports or supplies of Russian oil and natural gas were to be halted. A significant recession in Germany would then be virtually unavoidable. Christian Suing, Deutsche Bank CEO.
What you see on screen is the way gas consumption is distributed in Germany. As you can see, the largest German gas consumer is industry, in particular, heavy industry, which is terribly energy intensive. In total, it swallows almost 40% of total consumption. Then, there are households, which are responsible for just over 30% of gas consumption, mainly for heating, hot water, and cooking energy. And then between 9 and 15% of all gas consumed is used for electricity production. So according to estimates by various institutions, if Russia were to completely cut off gas supplies, in addition to being cold, Germans would face a major economic recession. And since the Germans, and by that I mean German politicians, are really afraid of crises, you can now understand why they have forced the European Commission to impose a plan to reduce gas consumption across Europe. But wait a minute, because not everything is Russia's fault. Germany itself has been an inevitable accomplice in bringing about this situation, and we are not just talking about Russian money. With the so-called energy transition, Germany has shut down 14 of its 17 nuclear reactors. In theory, the idea was to replace them with clean energies. The problem is that the most common renewables, wind and solar energy, do not have, as you all know, regular production. So they need a third source of energy to act as a backup. And German policy has made it so that those power plants are precisely the gas-fired ones. But that's not all. Germany also finds it much more difficult to replace Russian gas than other European countries. Why? Because it has no alternative infrastructure. As Russian gas was pouring in through pipelines, Germany never opted to build regasification plants to import liquefied natural gas. LNG, for those of you who do not know, is the way in which gas is transported in a liquid state on board large LNG carriers, meaning that when it arrives at a port, it needs regasification units to safely return it to its gaseous state. In other words, we are not only talking about the Germans not looking for alternative sources and not worrying about their dependence on Russian gas, but they did not even build an alternative infrastructure just in case, as other countries did. For example, about a decade ago, tiny Lithuania invested in a floating terminal to store and regasify liquefied natural gas. It's called Independence and is anchored in the port of Klaipėda. Well, this plant has enabled Lithuania to become the first European country to stop buying gas from Russia. Be that as it may, the fact is that Germany is facing a very complicated scenario, and that explains why they are working to reduce gas consumption in the run-up to winter. For example, they are reactivating their old coal-fired power plants. And right here, the nuclear issue comes up. After the Fukushima incident, Merkel decided to close all nuclear power plants in Germany, a stance that has become a state policy, but is now showing cracks. The debate is back on the table.
If we reactivate the 3 plants that were switched off last December, they could, together with the 3 that are still operating, replace all of the coal we import from Russia or 30% of the Russian gas. Mark Bernhard, member of the German parliament for AfD.
The reluctance to do so is not technical, but political. And at the moment, the resistance comes mainly from a very specific part of the government coalition.
It would be suicide for the Greens to say we were wrong about nuclear power, so they're forced to continue with the old battle plan. Thomas O'Donnell, a Germany-based energy analyst and nuclear physicist.
However, there are not many other alternatives alternatives, so at the very least, it is almost certain that the scheduled shutdown of the 3 remaining reactors scheduled for the end of 2022 will be delayed indefinitely.
Scholz opens door for extending nuclear power in Germany. Scholz says can make sense to keep Germany's nuclear plants running.
Anyway, that's the way things are in the heart of good old Europe. But having reached this point, it's your turn. Do you think Russia will end up cutting off all gas supplies to Germany? Will Europe be forced to ration gas? And what is even more important in the long term? Have the Germans learned once and for all how important it is to ensure energy security? Leave your opinion below in the comments. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel by clicking on the little bell so you don't miss any news. Also, if you like our work, you can help us improve and grow by joining our community on Patreon. You have the link in the description. That said, thank you all very much for being there. All the best, and I'll see you next time.